Hi, I'm Kavanagh, and I'm going to show you how I make a pumpkin pie. And indeed, they did originally start over pumpkins, but it's May, there aren't many pumpkins, and what I do over time is to make molds with my clay over pumpkins, and then I use those. I'm going to make a pumpkin pot today that has cats on the outside. This bowl is very similar, but it has dogs. But I just wanted you to see where I'm headed. So I start with the chunk of clay. And although this is my slab roller that will flatten my clay out, it would take a lot for it to flatten out where I need it when it's this thick. So I start with the old-fashioned rolling pin, and you have to have the right rolling pin because you will kill the ball bearings in your rolling pin immediately if you have one that has detachable handles. So I take it down a ways, and I'm using a brown stoneware clay so that my pot is going to be pretty sturdy when I get finished. Everything I make actually at Kahoka is stoneware, and all the glazes I use are food safe, etc. Now what I'm doing here is putting this slab of clay between two layers of canvas. That's so that when I run it through my slab roller, which is a wonderful, purely mechanical, not fancy, no motors kind of thing, and it just squishes the clay out in a flat manner between the board on the bottom and the roller, like the old-fashioned washing machines, basically. I take it, I want to get it as sort of roundish as I can. So I just keep moving it down on both sides, taking my roller down closer to the clay, and it takes several turns to get it down where I want it, which is around 1/4 of an inch thick. You can see, it looks like it's getting bigger, but it's just getting thinner. One more turn will do it. And then my clay is ready to work with. Now this pot was made out of the same clay, so you can see that the color changes. This has been fired twice, and it has a glaze on it, not on the bottom, but on the sides. So the color actually changes quite a bit over the entire process. I'm using a plate, an old platter, to make a circle. I never went to kindergarten, so I'm still making up for it. And I can take my excess clay, put it back in the bag and cover it up, because you don't want it to dry out. And then we take our mold, which is indeed a fired clay pumpkin. But before we put the clay on the pumpkin, I cover it with plastic, just whatever plastic bag came in the most recent box or from the dry cleaner or whatever. How they did this before plastic, I have no clue. I guess they were very careful with the leaves or something. And we're going to put this piece of clay on this pumpkin, alleged pumpkin, and put a turntable underneath, something to elevate my pumpkin a little bit so that it's at a workable level. And then I start pressing the clay down over the pumpkin. And there's a very simple implement for everything. One of the reasons I like this is that it's simple. Doesn't require lots of fancy technology. It just takes some elbow grease, some time, some hand building. And that's the part I like. Once I learned to throw on a wheel, I thought, well, this is the same thing over and over. But if I hand build, every pot would be different. Which of course they can also be on a wheel, but they tend to look more similar that way. So what I'm doing now is pressing the clay down over the ridges in the pumpkin. Every fall I look for the right size of one of those princess pumpkins or Cinderella pumpkins, whatever they call them, with the big ridges in them. And I use that pumpkin in here until it gives up the ghost, and then it goes in the compost. But the shape, hopefully before the pumpkin goes, I can make a new mold from that pumpkin. And I just feel like this gives me a more interesting bowl than if I were to make it over another bowl, which I also do with many of them. But the pumpkin pots have, to some extent, I suppose, become kind of my signature. Well, that and the leaves. Most of my pots actually have leaves on them, and these do not, because I am just going to attach other things.
Oh.
I'm back. We now have this clay on top of my pumpkin mold. We have plastic on top of that, which is how I pressed down in all the ridges. So I'm going to take my plastic off, and I'm going to stamp Kahoka in the bottom of it because later I'll forget if I don't do it. And then I'll show you how we make the figures that go on the pot. Now I said this one's going to be about cats. Sometimes they're about cats and dogs. This one is about dogs. I'll tell you my cat bowl story in a few minutes, but I just want you to see what I'm doing here. I have a commercial mold that has, these are the little doggy figures that went on there. I have one for cats. These are my kitty figures. Now you don't have to use those. A lot of my figures that I use are seashells Or I buy plastic animals, use my clay, make my own little molds, like I do with the real seashells. You can't put seashells on there, but you can. It really looks like seashells if you use a real shell and make a mold of it. You may notice that I have brown clay here and a gray clay that will fire to this buff color in the end. I want that contrast. So what I do is stuff some of my lighter clay into the mold, bang it down so it gets in all the little corners, scoop off any extra, and then, as the students say, how am I going to get it out of the mold? Well, I guess I need to move this thing so you can see what I'm doing. There, maybe that's better. And you take a little wad of clay and just keep working your figure until it can come out of the mold. Then you take a needle tool, which is just that, a pointed little metal tool. Well, I like the metal ones, they're sturdier. And I'm going to apply my kitty cat to this bowl. Now, notice that you're making this bowl upside down. You can't turn it over because the clay is too wet and it would just sort of collapse off of the mold. So we've got to remember, as we put the figures on, to keep them upside down. And occasionally I get nearly around the pot and think, oh, there's one that got on the wrong way. What I'm doing with the needle tool is scoring the back of my kitty. But I also need to do that on the actual pot so that when we attach it, it will be, oh, I see what you're doing. My camera person has just decided to get this more authentic. What I did was score my pot. I scored the back of the kitty, and now I'm adding slip. And slip is nothing more than clay and water. It's very liquid. It's basically the Elmer's that I'm using here. And I'm attaching. You've got to attach well. You want it to stick, and if you don't score both sides, there's a good chance that it will pop off as it dries or in the kiln. So there's our first kitty, and we can go around this entire pot and add more kitties or add flowers or whatever you might like. That's what I like about the hand building, is that each pot is different. You figure out where you want your piece, you score the clay, score this clay, and I'm careful to make sure that because I'm using different types of clay here, they're not just different colors, but they're different origins or different clays. I need to make sure that they will be compatible with each other, that I can fire them together, and the main consideration is that when you work in clay, about 10% of your pot is going to end up about 10% smaller than it is originally. As it dries and the moisture goes out of it, it shrinks. You put it in the kiln, it shrinks some more. So you've got to figure that you're going to have about a 10% loss as you make your, your finished product will be 10% smaller than you started with. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're playing in the clay, as I do. let me tell you my kitty story. Several years ago, I sold a pot like this, a good sized one like this, to a woman in Harrisonburg. And the next year she came back to the same sale and told me about her pot. She took her kitty pot home, she put it on the kitchen counter, and then she started thinking, oh, I don't know, do I want to put it in the cupboard, wash it up, put it in the cupboard, use it as a serving bowl, because the clay is non-toxic, the glazes are food safe. There's no reason why she couldn't do that. Or do I want to leave it on the kitchen counter and put my mail in it and my keys and stuff like that? So that night she left it on the counter, and the next morning she got up and there was her cat, sound asleep in the bowl. So it ended up on the counter, and for all I know, it may still be there because she gave it to the cat as a sleeping bowl, and the cat obviously figured out what to do about it. So these bowls have all kinds of uses, and you can't always anticipate what they'll end up doing. But they are, all of the Kahoka stoneware is always, I make sure that I use only things that are safe. Even in the big pots that are really too large. This is a little mouse to go with this ball of yarn, to go with this little thing that says, I love cats. And as you can see, now it's up to me to go around this entire pot, keep applying things, and leaving it like that. You can use almost anything for design. You can use stamps like this. This is a bear claw. We don't want that on a kitty pot. But I do have little kitty prints that I can make, and just make them all the way around. And then later, when I show you about the glazing process, and this pot is a long time from that, because after I finish making this pot, building the pot, it's going to have to dry probably, well, if it keeps raining, it could be a long time, but at least a week, maybe more, and often more if it's a rainy period, although I do sometimes use my dehumidifier to speed things up if I'm impatient. Then it gets fired the first, which is around 2300 degrees. So this pot has a whole future ahead of it. At this point, it only has a couple of kitties on it and a bunch of kitty prints around, and now I'm going to continue to put other things around, and then we can talk about the glazing process on a different pot. Hi, I'm back with our pot that we made yesterday with the upside down kitties around it, and it's made over the pumpkin, or the ceramic pumpkin, the replica of the pumpkin. All night it sat out uncovered because I needed the clay to start to harden, but I did keep plastic around the rim so that the rim didn't get too tight, and so that it wouldn't crack. Now I need to take this pot off of the pumpkin. We can get rid of all this plastic. This is a bigger piece of plastic than I should have, actually. We will move this pumpkin, and now we have a pot with pussycats right side up. We hope. The first thing we have to do is to clean the edge of the pot. I like to do as much cleaning on every pot before it dries and before it gets bisque fired as I can. It saves a lot of time later. And I'm just using a very messy sponge to go along the edges to get rid of the rough edges and to smooth it out. Sometimes I have some little places like this that I can trim off. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that. You can see the process. It's just another messy part of this whole process. And I might say that, you know, you don't have to be young, you don't have to be particularly strong or agile or anything else. Anybody can hand build pottery, but you have to be ready to get dirty. I always have clay all over me. But today, as we progress, I will get glaze all over me to go in the clay. And I want to move along and show you what happens after the pot that we cleaned. It's going to sit on a shelf. Here's another kitty pot from yesterday. It's still very wet. The colors, it's firm enough that I can handle it. I clean the edges and so forth, and it's just going to sit on this shelf for about a week, probably more than that, until I have enough pots to make an entire load in my kiln, and then I will fire it. And that is a bisque firing. It's the first of 2 firings, and it goes up. I fire to cone 04, and which is just a fairly simple code actually, and it's about around 1900 degrees. It takes quite a while, probably about 12 hours or more for a complete firing, because I don't want it to go real quickly or shock the clay. I want it to go slowly enough that it gradually turns, well, gets all the moisture out of the clay and turns my stoneware clay into a bisque form. Here is a pot that was originally a leaf from the burdock, or from the, not the burdock, the rhubarb. And I actually have a couple of those here, and I'm going to go through the glazing process using these, since our kitty pot has to dry and get bisque before we can glaze it. So I started with the slab roller, rolled out clay, put my leaf on it, and I cut out that giant vein that's underneath, you know, the stem, because it would cut right through the clay. So that got trimmed down. Then I cut around the leaf, and I just draped it with plastic in between over a bowl, and did the same process as we did with the other pots. But this one has been bisque. This was the buff clay, not the darker brown clay. It's buff clay to start with, but when it's fired, it will to stoneware, it will be a cream color, not quite as white as it is. But because I love leaves, I really like to use leaves on a lot of things, and I like to show up the beauty of the leaves and the intricacies of their veining. As I mentioned before, when I clean the pots, I like the edges before they ever get fired, before they dry. I want them to be fairly smooth, but, and you won't like the sound, but there may be some rough edges, so you take time to go around your pot, make sure that nothing is going to be too rough. It's very possible to have an edge that, you know, somebody could get, well, could get cut with if you're not careful. So what I do with these leaves, any leaves, I use all kinds of leaves, is blacken the actual veining so that it will be, when we're done, when we're done, it will look like this. Now, this is a big old rhubarb leaf, but this is actually from last year. But you can see the blackened veins, which show up so much better than they do with just the bisque pot. If we fired that pot without putting the black in there, you really couldn't see the veining. So this is what we're looking for. But I will come back to that and show you some other things about it. So this is another one of those mini time-consuming processes that a hand-built pot goes through, or most pottery will go through. This is my black glaze. It's a glaze I know well. It doesn't drip, so I like to use it. And I simply paint it on. Now, all of these many parts of the process just take time. So the key to enjoying them is to download books from the library, listen to those books, lots of books, or maybe you have somebody to work with, and that works too. But I mean, it can be tedious if you weren't doing anything, and I must say, I go through a lot of books, lots and lots of books, from Massanutten and from the West Virginia Library. I'm not going to do this whole thing now, but you can see what happens. You end up with the whole thing covered in black, and then I wash most of that black glaze off, and you can see the veining that's in there, and that's the key to making your leaf look like a leaf pot. Of course, it would be the entire outside. Now, I don't have anything on the inside yet. And there are many, many options for different kinds of glazes. They just have to be all stoneware glazes. I talked about the bisque firing. The bisque firing being to cone 04, but my stoneware firing goes to cone 6, which is about 2300 degrees. So my glazes have to match that. And they have to match each other. And they also have to be compatible with each other. I get all my supplies in Baltimore in a very reliable source, and I'm able to trust not only the glazes that I use, but my experience with them to know what goes together and what will happen. So here's yet another rhubarb leaf, okay? We bisqued it. We put the black on, wipe the black off, and then I glaze the inside. And the point of this is that I want to have the inside, I want it pretty. Now, sometimes I put a leaf on the inside as well as the outside, so I have a leaf out here and a leaf in here, and I'll just do black on both sides and wipe it all off, and it's like a big leaf. However, I frequently do this, put color on the inside. There are a couple of reasons for that. Not only do I just like the way it looks, and this is my favorite glaze, my ancient copper, but I like the way it looks, but I also don't have to worry about the glaze dripping if it's on the inside. If it's on the outside, and I just have my leaf on the inside, I have to pay a little more attention to which glaze is not going to drip down and attach itself to the kiln shelf. But you don't have to worry about that yet. Let's talk about glazing. Glazing is just what glazes form a layer of glass when they melt. So they're chemicals that will come together, basically form a layer of glass on the pot, as they melt in the kiln at a very high temperature. Many of them come in powdered form. Some of them actually I purchased in a container in a liquid form. But glazes are kind of fun because what you see is typically not what you get. And this is something that always boggles the students. This green glaze is called spring green, and it will be almost that color after it comes out of the kiln. This glaze is actually a peacock glaze, and right now it's gray. I mean, it does not look like what it's going to look like later. The reason I brought this one out, which I'm not putting, I like to put greens and earthy colors on my leaf pots, but this is a blue. It's a nice blue, but the color of the glaze is actually this red. When you put it on, it's red, and the average adult student says, "Are you sure? Is this going to work? How is this going to be blue?" And you just have to trust it's going to be blue. Kids never argue with that. They say, okay, and they don't doubt. But the adults are like, it's red. How is it going to ever be blue? That's not going to work. So that's just a warning when you get to the glaze part. Now, we have this pot that's glazed. The reason for putting the peacock around the spring green is that I like to have a mixture inside. Honestly, can't tell you what all's in here. I have lots of blues and greens. I love to combine them, and I just like the colors inside. Or sometimes I'll use like the copper one, which is, like I said, my favorite to start with. Okay, now we've done the inside. We've put the black on, wiped most of it off, done the glazing inside, and then I typically have to let that pot sit around for a day or so because it's kind of damp after all of that. I want it dry before I do the next. I have 2 more steps in the glazing process. So here's a pot that has dogs on the outside. It's not like the other doggy pot because these are from molds that I made from plastic animals. So they're more in the shape of real dogs rather than just characters. But I need to glaze the outside of the pot. So we're moving along here to a different glaze. Where did I put the brush that the dog had taken? Anyhow, this is another pottery is not meant to be done by people who are OCD and very tidy. It's kind of a messy process. Like I said, I typically have either clay or glaze all over me on a given day. I'll use this one. No, I won't either because it's got something else on it. Anyhow, what I do now, this is a clear glaze. What happened to the brush that you picked up? We've lost the brush. I'll use this one, Bill. It's okay for what we're doing now. Clearly we're not up to this task. It's a clear glaze that I've used a lot. I buy it in 50-pound bags, dry, and that will last me a good long while. By the way, pottery is not an expensive thing. I mean, as long as you've got some place to fire your pots. And the clay is really very inexpensive, but the glazes can really add up, particularly if you get them commercially produced and in jars that actually contain a lot of fluid. So I think we're moving. So what I'm doing with this little doggy pot is that I put my clear glaze, which actually goes on in a gray color, but dries all over the pot, making sure that I come up to the edge and that I get down in any little pockets, any little places that might, like here's a spot. I want the glaze is going to help hold those figures on. Now we scored them yesterday. We put the slip on, which certainly is crucial, but the glaze is also going to help fix the entire thing. Now, even after this first the black, wiping that all off. Oh, I should show you the bottom. Here's the bottom of my pot. This is going to sit on the shelf in the kiln. What's crucial here is that my final glaze doesn't come onto the bottom. Remember the stamp with the little paw prints? Okay, that goes around. I put the black in there, I wiped it off. I can trust that black. It's not going to drip. It's not going to end up on the shelf. Here's my Kahoka stamp. People ask me, what is Kahoka? Kahoka is a word that I created out of the first two letters of each of my names. So it's nothing terribly exotic. But I've got my black glaze in the footprints, wipe that off, put my clear glaze on the rest of the pot. But the reason that we don't want the glaze to be on the kiln shelf is that when that glaze melts and becomes that layer of glass, it will affix itself to the kiln shelf forever. And you just don't want that to happen. So you leave an area on the bottom and the glaze comes down far enough that you can, oh, here we go. Here is the other little doggy pot, or one of them, and you can see the clear glaze comes down just like that one did, pretty close to the bottom, but the little black feet, or the glaze that's in the feet, the footprints, does not melt and does not stick on the kiln shelf. And this is what we want to happen. We just do not want a pot stuck forever to the kiln shelf. And okay, I have one more step. Now, this is a multi-step process, as you figured out a long time ago. I'll get this down out of the way. And this messy container is my final trim, which is called saturation gold for reasons I don't understand. There's also a silver version, but I just like the gold color and the dark. To me, it's what gives me my pots a final, I don't know, I like the edging. It kind of finishes them off, and again, you need a good book to do this with, and you just go around your entire lip of the pot, or you can use this saturation gold in other places, but I typically just use it on the edge of the final part of the glazing process, and I do it last. If I do it at some other part of the sequence, chances are it will get messed up, so it always ends up being the final thing. And what it does is gives me this slightly metallic looking. It looks quite gold if you get if it's on thick enough, or if just black if it's thin. But to me, it produces just a final touch on these very rustic, hand-built pots. And that's how I make them.